This is the 7.1 notes on Lewis structures. In our last unit, we talked about the three types of bonding that can occur: covalent, ionic, and metallic. And all of these bonds depend upon the electronegativities of the atoms that are involved. Recall, electronegativity is the tendency of an atom to attract a shared pair of electrons in a bond. And the trend for electronegativity on the periodic table is as follows. Electronegativity is going to increase across a period, and it's going to increase going up a group. That makes fluorine the most electronegative atom. Remember, the noble gases do not bond, so they do not have electronegativity values. So this is the most electronegative atom on the periodic table. In addition, we can divide the periodic table into metals and nonmetals using our staircase. Anything that is to the left of the staircase is going to be a metal, and anything to the right will be a nonmetal. So it follows that metals on the left-hand side are going to have low electronegativities, while nonmetals are going to have high because electronegativity increases as we go across. So the three different types of bonds, the atoms that are involved with them, we have covalent, which is a nonmetal bonded with another nonmetal. Ionic is going to be a metal with a nonmetal. And then finally metallic is a metal with another metal. It follows the same pattern with electronegativity. Nonmetals, which are high electronegativity, that means a covalent bond is between two atoms with high electronegativities. Ionic will be low and high. And finally, the electronegativity of metal atoms are both low. So the difference between these electronegativities, for covalent, there is no difference or very little difference. For ionic, there is going to be a big difference. And then finally for metallic, again, no or very little difference between the electronegativities of the two atoms. So how do these bonds form then? For covalent bonds, the electrons are going to be shared. And then for ionic, there's actually going to be a transfer of electrons between the atoms, and that's going to form ions. And then the opposite ions, the positive and the negatives, are going to attract. So opposite ions will attract. Finally, for metallic bonding, the way the electrons are going to be working is the sea of electrons model, where the electrons are free to flow between the different cations. So the types of bonds that occur will determine the structure or the arrangement of the atoms in the compound. So for ionic compounds, because we're dealing with ions that are oppositely charged, it's going to be dealing with those electrostatic forces. The structure is going to depend on maximizing the electrostatic forces between opposite charges, because the opposite charges are attracted and want to be closer together, and minimizing the repelling forces that occur between like charges. What this means is my negative ion is going to want to be close to this positive ion, but it's going to want to be farther away from the other negative ion. For covalent compounds, atoms share electrons. So what's going to happen is the shape is going to depend on the locations of these electrons. Either they're going to be shared between two atoms, or they're going to be unshared, and they're going to only be found on one atom. We can show this relationship using something called a Lewis structure. So far, we have looked at what is called a formula, and the formula tells us the types of atoms present, like carbon and hydrogen, and how many of each, 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens. Lewis structures are going to tell us a little bit more information. The Lewis structure not only tells us the types and numbers of atoms present, but also how they're bonded together. So for instance, this carbon is bonded to this hydrogen. Hydrogen is not bonded to another hydrogen. Next time we are going to look at the three-dimensional shape, and that is known as VSEPR. But for today, for Lewis structures, the Lewis structures will tell us the number and types of bonds that are present around the atom. To do that, we first need to draw electron dot structures for these atoms to know how many valence electrons we're dealing with. So for carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine, we start off with their symbols for electron dot structures, and then we're going to add valence electrons. And remember, we figure out the valence electrons by looking at the periodic table. Carbon is in the 14th group, or the 4A group. That means it's going to have 4 valence electrons that we place around it. Nitrogen is in the 15th group, or the 5A group, so it has 5 valence electrons. Oxygen is in the 16th, or 6A group, so it has 6 valence electrons. And finally, fluorine is a halogen in the 17 or 7A group, and therefore has 7 valence electrons. So, based on the octet rule and the fact that all of these atoms are going to want to have 8 electrons, they're going to form different numbers of bonds. Carbon still can have, or it still needs, 4 more electrons to complete its octet. So that means carbon will make 4 bonds. Nitrogen needs 3 more electrons to complete its octet, so it will make 3 bonds. Oxygen will make 2 bonds. And finally, fluorine and the other halogens only need 1 more electron, and so they can only make 1 bond. So the number of bonds an atom can make depends on the number of valence electrons. Carbon is able to make up to 4 bonds, which is the maximum we have, and that makes it a very versatile atom and the backbone of many of the molecules that we'll see in biology. So for instance, these molecules we'll see often in biochemistry and in biology. So this, for instance, is a fatty acid and a glycerol and a phosphate group. This makes up a phospholipid. And each one of these is a carbon that's bonded to another carbon, or actually 2 other carbons and 2 hydrogens on here. Here we have a protein. Each one of these is an amino acid. And a long chain of amino acids makes the protein. Here we have 2 different sugars. We have glucose and we have ribose. So these are the carbohydrates. And finally, here we have a nucleotide. And remember, nucleotides make up the nucleic acids, or our DNA and RNA, and also ATP. So in all of these, you can see there's a lot of carbon in each one of these structures. And so carbon's very important in biology. In a Lewis structure, electrons are going to be shown as dots. And so a pair of electrons will be 2 dots. That's what we call a shared pair. And then, oh, I'm sorry, that's a lone pair. Lone pair. And then a shared pair between 2 atoms is going to be shown as a line. And so this will be a shared pair. So when we are looking at a Lewis structure, we are connecting the atoms to each other. Let's take water, for instance. Water is H2O, which means it has 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom. And there's different ways we could put that together. We could put it together with an H in the middle, so HHO, or we could put O in the middle, HOH. And so one of these is correct and one is not. And the way to figure out what they are, we have to look at the electron dot structures for these. So hydrogen has 1 valence electron. Oxygen has 6. So what this means is oxygen just needs 2 more to complete its octet. So oxygen is able to make 2 bonds. Now hydrogen is a little bit different than the other ones. It has an octet rule, but it's not 8 that it wants. To fill its outer shell, or its valence shell, it only needs 2 electrons in that valence shell. It already has 1, so it just needs 1 more. So 1 more electron will make it have a full valence shell, and so hydrogen can only make 1 bond. It can only share 2 electrons. Well, right here we have a shared pair, so that's 2 electrons, and a second shared pair, so that's another 2 electrons. So this hydrogen right here is actually has 2 bonds. And hydrogen just doesn't do that. Hydrogen can only make 1 bond. So this structure is wrong. And that means that oxygen has to be in the center, or it has 2 bonds that it's making. So to draw Lewis structures, there are some rules that we will be following in order to do that. So let's go ahead and do an example problem. So the first one we're going to do is going to be methane, or CH4. So the first thing we need to do is count the valence electrons. We've got to do a little bit of math. So for methane, the way we start is we're going to put the atoms. So we have carbon and hydrogen. And the first number is going to be the number of atoms that are present. And we get this from the formula. So carbon, there's 1 carbon, and there are 4 hydrogens. So it comes from the subscripts. The second number we're going to put here is going to be the number of valence electrons, and we get this from the periodic table. So carbon has 4 valence electrons, just think about the electron dot structure that we did, and hydrogen has 1. So in all, it gets 4 valence electrons from the carbons, 4 from all the hydrogens. So in total, it has 8 valence electrons that are going to be shared between all the atoms, or 4 pairs. All right, so step number 2 is to pick the center atom. And the center atom is going to be the one that is least electronegative. And this makes sense because whoever's in the middle has to share the electrons the most. Electronegative atoms don't want to do that, so they're going to go on the outside because they don't want to share. Now, carbon and hydrogen actually have very similar electronegativities. So we're going to use a different rule to determine which one goes on the inside. And that's the fact that hydrogen can only make 1 bond. So hydrogen will always be on the outside. That means that the carbon is going to be our center atom. So I'm going to put carbon in the center. And then the next step is to attach the other atoms around that central atom. And each attachment is going to be a shared pair of electrons. That's going to be that dashed line. So here's one of the hydrogens. Here's the second one, the third one, and the fourth one. So I have attached all 4 of my hydrogens. All of the atoms are present. And each attachment required a bond. Remember, these are going to be 2 electrons represented there that they both share. So I have now used 2, 4, 6, 8 of my electrons. I've used all 8 or the 4 pairs, and so I cannot add any more electrons. The next thing we need to do is actually check to see if everybody is happy. All atoms are happy if they have 8. That's the octet rule. Except for hydrogen, who is happy to have 2. So this hydrogen has 2, this one has 2, and this one has 2, and this one has 2. For the carbon, we can remember they're going to be shared, so they can count for the carbon also. The carbon has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons around it. So it has its octet rule fulfilled, and so carbon is also happy. Since all of the atoms are bonded together and they all have the number of electrons that they want, this is the Lewis structure. This is the complete structure for methane. And then finally, the number of shared and lone pairs around the center atom. That's what we're looking at here, the center atom. Carbon has 4 shared pairs of electrons and no lone pairs. Remember, the lone pairs are going to be the dots and the shared pairs are the dashes. All right, the next structure we're going to do is carbon dioxide. So again, we're going to write down the elements carbon and oxygen. And based on the formula, I have 1 carbon and 2 oxygens. The number of valence electrons, carbon has 4 and oxygen has 6. This gives me a total of 16 electrons for this structure, or 8 pairs. Out of these 2, carbon and oxygen, carbon is the least electronegative. Remember, oxygen is closer to that fluorine, that trend that happens on the periodic table. So carbon is going to go in the center. And then I'm going to attach my oxygens around it. So I've used 4 of my electrons, or 2 pairs. I still have 6 more pairs to go. So the next step is to add the electrons, and we're going to add them to the outer atoms first because they're more electronegative. They want the electrons more. So this oxygen here already has 2 electrons. That's 4, 6, and 8. So it has 8 electrons now, and it's happy. I have used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of my 8 pairs. I still have 3 more pairs. So I'm going to go over to this one and add those 3 pairs to it. Now I have used all 8 of my pairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pairs of electrons. I do not have any other electrons to add. So now I need to check to make sure everybody is happy. So this oxygen has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons around it. This oxygen has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons around it. And this carbon has 2, 4. It only has 4 electrons. So this carbon is not happy. It needs 4 more electrons to complete its octet. Now the way we're going to do this is to make the outer atoms share their lone pairs. So instead of just keeping it to itself, we're going to make this oxygen share these electrons. And so that's going to give carbon 2 more. So that's a total of 6. And then we're going to make this oxygen also share his electrons. And so now carbon will have the 8 electrons that it needs. And so the formula we're going to, or the structure is going to have a double bond between carbon and oxygen on one side, and then the oxygen still has 2 lone pairs. And then on the other side, it's going to be another double bond, again, with the oxygen having 2 lone pairs that are left over. So let's double check our structure to make sure everybody is happy. We've used a total of only 8 electron pairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we check to make sure that every atom is happy. And this oxygen has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons. Remember, each one of these lines represents 2 electrons. This oxygen has 2, 4, 6, 8. It has 8 and is happy. And then carbon has 2, 4, 6, 8 electrons. So even though all 8 of them he's having to share, he still does have 8. So around the center atom then, I have 4 shared pairs of electrons, and again, 0 lone pairs. There are no single dots around the carbon itself. All right, the last structure we're going to do is hydrogen cyanide. So again, we can do the elements. We can kind of do a shortcut now. I know how many of each of these I have. I have 1 of each, and so I can just add up the valence electrons. I have 1 valence electron from hydrogen, 4 from carbon, and 5 from the nitrogen. That gives me a total of 10 electrons, or 5 pairs. So again, this came from the hydrogen, this was from the carbon, and this was from the nitrogen. All right, out of these, the one that is going to go in the center is the one that is least electronegative. So that would be either the carbon or the hydrogen. Remember, hydrogen always goes on the outside, so carbon has to go in the center. So I'm going to put carbon in the center, and I'm going to attach the nitrogen and the hydrogen around it. So I've used 2 of my pairs. Now I have 3 more pairs to go, and so I'm going to start adding the electrons to the outside first, the more electronegative atoms. Now H is already happy. Remember, H is happy with 2 electrons, and here's its 2 electrons, so it doesn't want any more. This nitrogen, though, does. So I can add my 3rd, my 4th, and my 5th pair of electrons around it. And so I've used all 5 of my pairs, all 10 electrons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pairs. And then I just check to make sure everybody's happy. This hydrogen is happy with its 2. This nitrogen has 2, 4, 6, 8 around it. But this carbon only has 4 electrons around it. So again, it's not happy, and we need to make this nitrogen share the lone pairs. We're going to move these lone pairs to make them become a shared pair. That's going to give carbon 6. And then we move 1 more lone pair, and that will give it 8. So the final structure for this is going to be a triple bond between carbon and nitrogen, and then nitrogen will have its own lone pair left over. So around the carbon, there are, again, 4 shared pairs of electrons, and again, 0 lone pairs. The last thing I want to talk about is the polarity or the bond character of the the covalent bonds we form. So in covalent bonds, the differences between electronegativities of the two nonmetal atoms will produce either polar molecules or nonpolar molecules. If the difference is 0 or very small, it's going to be nonpolar. So here we have our nonpolar, and this is the difference in electronegativity right here. So if the difference in electronegativity is very small, I get nonpolar. Typically all atoms that bond with themselves, like that, and carbon-hydrogen bonds are considered nonpolar. So nonpolar covalent bond is a covalent bond that results in equal sharing of electrons. If the difference in electronegativity is larger, that's going to create a polar bond. So these are going to be polar. And then of course if the difference is really large, then this is ionic down here. But we're just looking at covalent. So what happens with the difference is the more electronegative atom is going to attract the electrons to itself and pull them closer to itself. It's still technically sharing, but it's just taking a larger share of it. So let's take, for instance, carbon and oxygen. So if I have a carbon-oxygen bond like this, the oxygen is a little bit more electronegative, which means it's going to pull the electrons, use a different color, it's going to pull these electrons toward it. And that's going to leave the carbon with fewer electrons. It's going to be slightly positive on this side. So a polar covalent bond is a covalent bond that results in unequal sharing of electrons. And this means that there's going to be poles. The carbon, or actually the oxygen, because it's pulling the electrons towards it, you can kind of think of that as the negative pole. And then the carbon, because it doesn't have as many electrons, is going to be a positive pole. But instead of doing positive poles, negative poles, we actually use different symbols. The unequal sharing of the negative electrons means the bond is not equal, and there's going to be something called a partial charge. There will be a partial negative charge, which we use this symbol for, on the more electronegative atom, and then a partial positive charge on the less electronegative atom. So for the carbon-oxygen bond here, the oxygen would be partially negative, and the carbon would be partially positive. All right, and the last practice problem we have here, it says determine if each bond in ethanol, and this is ethanol like alcohol, determine if each bond in ethanol and water is polar and nonpolar. And so we need to draw the water first, and then figure out if things are polar or nonpolar. So recall from before, the structure for water is an H and an O and an H. Now, this is not its complete Lewis structure. We have two H's, each with one valence electron. So that's going to be 2 valence electrons plus oxygen's 6. So I actually need 8 electrons on here, or 4 pairs. And what happens here is H is happy, it's got its 2. This H is happy, it's got its 2. But the oxygen does not. It only has 4, and it wants 8. So oxygen actually has 2 lone pairs of electrons around it and 2 shared pairs of electrons. So this is going to be oxygen. Now, the bonds on these, O and H, that is going to be a polar bond. C and H, that's going to be a nonpolar bond. C and O is going to be a polar bond. And O and H, again, is going to be a polar bond. And then the last thing we need to do is, if it's a polar bond, we should show the partial charges. So what's happening here is between the O and the O is actually pulling the electrons toward itself. And so that leaves the other side of it slightly positive. So the H will be slightly positive and the O will be slightly negative. On here, the C and H's are nonpolar, so there's going to be no partial charges on those. But the polar bonds will. So again, with the OH, the O is pulling the electrons towards it. That leaves the H as a partial positive. The O will be partially negative. With the C and O, the O is also pulling electrons towards it in this bond. And so again, it's going to be partially negative, and the carbon will be left as partially positive. And that is the structures for ethanol and water.